Hello, my name is Lizzie. I'm Anglican. In about 4 months' time, I'm going to be entering a convent ready to become a postulant. And this video is going to be about my kind of spiritual background and the main spiritual influences in my life to date.
I will hold your people in my heart. I suppose we could start with me being born. I was born on Pentecost Sunday, which I've always quite liked. And I was born into a Christian family. Both my parents are Christian. All my life, my dad has been an Anglican priest. Well, he's retired now, but so I've grown up in a clergy household. Although, as you'll find out in a bit, because I've spent so much of my life away from home that I've had lots of other influences as well. Um, so in terms of my home life or my home church, when you're an Anglican vicar, you normally move church about every 7 years. So we did that growing up. I moved house when we were three. When I was three, we moved house, and then again when I think I was about 12, and then again when I was about 18 or so. Um, so the those churches when my dad was vicar for those different phases of my life growing up were all very different from each other, and these were the churches that I was at um, in just in the school holidays from age 8 upwards because I went away to school. So the church that we were at from when I was age 3 to 12 um, was, I mean, they were all Anglican, but it was kind of uh, charismatic Church of England. So it had there was a small robed choir that I used to sing in with my brother and sister, and then there was also a worship band. And I think every Sunday we would have a Eucharist. It was quite kind of middle of the road Anglican Eucharist, but there'd be lots of we I think the main hymn book was Songs of Fellowship, if you're familiar with that. And so there were probably more kind of choruses than traditional hymns. And yeah, there was a worship band, and there were times either in the main Eucharist when people might put their hands in the air while they were praising God, or I think sometimes there were times when people might feel towards the end of the service, or in a certain section of it, that they had a word to share or a vision to share or that kind of thing. Or if that wasn't in the main service, there definitely were sometimes maybe like Sunday evening or midweek evening services that were more um, open to that kind of thing, of people sharing visions or praying for healing and those kinds of things. So that was obviously part of my upbringing. And then when I was 12, I think it's in the wrong words, we moved to a church that was a lot more traditional Anglican, and to me it felt very Anglo-Catholic to me, but I don't think it was. But that was where I learnt more about, um, I suppose, just things like Holy Week and the liturgical year more. Uh, Although while we were there, this was when I was, yeah, between about 12 and 18, and it wasn't the kind of church that really you're naturally going to want to go to as a teenager. So actually, my dad said, "Well, what kind of church um, do you feel it is going to best kind of benefit you spiritually?" And there was a big charismatic evangelical church, um, a couple of, well, not far away anyway. So my dad used to offer to drive us there in the evening, so that we had that as well, um, growing up. So yeah, that was really cool that we were enabled to go to a church that felt right for us. Yeah. So again, I suppose during those years, and this was in the holidays when I wasn't at school, I had that dual upbringing of the traditional church in the morning, and then often going to the more student evangelical charismatic church in the evening. And then after that, because this was like beyond when I'm 18 now, my family moved again to a different church, but that wasn't so much part of my upbringing, and I wasn't there so much. And that was more of a kind of, I suppose, middle of the road area, that not such a sort of affluent area at all, and a big West Indian a large percentage of the congregation were West Indian, so it had a different vibe to it again. But yeah, when I was just after I turned 8, I managed to get a scholarship to a Christian boarding school, and that was an Anglican school, and it was, looking back, it was what you would call open evangelical. And so we'd have like a morning chapel service that was more like a thought for the day than an actual formal service each morning, with maybe, I guess, some prayers and a not usually a hymn, but more like a song, because I used to sing in a worship band at school. And we'd have, I think, Eucharist maybe once a month on a Sunday morning, and it was a school that would encourage you, if you wanted to get baptized, you could in the school swimming pool. If you wanted to get confirmed, you could. So the main school, like the chaplain and the staff were, not all the staff were Anglican, but the school services were Church of England. But then a lot of the pupils at my school were from other countries and from other church traditions. Like obviously there were some day pupils who were, I don't remember that many posh people at my school, but I guess they had money, because not all of us were on scholarships there. But I mixed around with the boarders a lot more, and I was one of the few white or English, native English boarding pupils at the school. And most of my peers that I grew up with were either from Hong Kong or from African countries or from America. They were like African American. And so sometimes various friends would invite me to their churches. So quite a few friends invited me to big charismatic churches, obviously outside of school grounds, but we were allowed to go out when we got a bit older. So I'd go out to some of their churches on like a Sunday afternoon. So those were big kind of like vineyard type churches, and just like big Pentecostal or charismatic churches. And my more like African American friends would invite me sometimes to more Black Pentecostal style churches. And so I grew up at the same time at this school and I was at this school from age 8 to 18. So on top of the sort of more formal Church of England services coming through the school, in my free time, especially Sunday afternoons or Sunday evenings or special events at weekends put on for young Christians, I'd be going to places where it was common for people to be like praying in tongues, sharing visions, or all the kind of things that I'd come across anyway in the church where my dad was vicar when I was little. So again, I was having like multiple influences growing up. And so we get to when I'm about, let's skip my gap year, because that's I went to Kenya for 1 year, and that was with the Anglican Church in Kenya. But after that I went to uni, and so it was just completely up to me what church I went to. And by now it was the big evangelical charismatic church I'd been going to as a teenager in my holidays back home was starting to feel a bit too, I started to feel like it was no longer the right church for me, and I wasn't quite sure why, but it just, some of the teaching didn't quite feel like my own theology anymore or something like that. So when I was at uni, I was sort of in this transition. So I was going to a kind of quite evangelical but Church of England church in the evenings, and sometimes going to the cathedral in the mornings and sort of feeling like I was a bit of both. But yeah, going to only one of those two didn't feel enough for me spiritually. It's like I needed the Eucharist and some of the teaching in the cathedral, but I also needed something of the maybe like the focus on more, something like the more personal relationship with Jesus that I got in a more evangelical church, or something like that anyway. And at this time, while I was at uni, I acquired a boyfriend who was Roman Catholic, and so we sometimes would make a compromise on going to an Anglo-Catholic chapel for their services. And that was where I met the chaplain, and he started encouraging me to come to morning prayer. And so he was the one that really taught me all about lectionaries and morning and evening prayer, and he explained lots of the reasons behind more Anglo-Catholic rituals. And through a combination of going to the cathedral and learning things from him, I just grew a much deeper appreciation of some of the like symbolism that you get in church services, because it had been the meaning of it had been explained to me. Because I've always hated like doing things just for ritual's sake, or because it's always been done that way. I really can't stand that kind of thinking. But yeah, once I realized like the depth of meaning behind these things, I really liked it. So from then on, from like age 18 onwards, and I'm 32 now, I suppose I've been becoming increasingly like the Catholic side of the Church of England, but I still needed something profoundly spiritual to balance out the kind of sometimes churchiness of church, if that makes any sense at all. So yeah, that was when I started reading Carmelite stuff, and I've been reading Carmelite like spirituality theology ever since, really. And I then went on from uni to train to be a priest, and that was even more of a I was surrounded even more by, you know, when people are talking about like which candle should we light first, and you know, all this kind of stuff that seems so superficial and annoying to me, that it made me all the more spend as much time as possible in the spirituality section of the library there. And that's what made me all the more want to grow in what you might call contemplative prayer, because I saw that as just really balancing out the more formal, or yeah, let's say formal forms of prayer that I was also growing in at the same time. So I've always felt like I needed a balance of formal prayer and informal prayer. And the informal prayer might be me praying in tongues, or it might be me praying contemplative prayer without words, or just using my own words rather than set words. Yeah, where have we got to? So yeah, increasingly while I was training to be a priest, I just found myself getting more and more frustrated with the over churchianity kind of vibes that I was getting, and so I tried to counteract that all the more with contemplative prayer and Carmelite spirituality especially. And then it was during this time actually that I became really interested in the topic of people's jobs, and how if that's where we are most of the week, then that needs to be where a lot of our spiritual focus is, rather than like church. I mean, we are the church, but rather than just where we are on a Sunday and the church buildings and the church services and things. So I'm trying to think, I did some really interesting papers while I was like at theological college. One of them was about how I chose to look at some Anglo-Catholic priests and how the charismatic movement had personally affected them. These were ones that sort of became charismatic at the same time as being Anglo-Catholic, because I've always been interested in that that hybrid, like because I feel that I'm a bit of both as well. So that was one of my papers. But yeah, the one I was going to mention was I looked at Francis de Sales, who wrote a lot of letters to people who weren't monks and nuns, to say to them, you're not called to be any less holy than a monk or a nun. And he would sort of write letters to different people, talking to them about how they could become a saint or be holy in their own line of work or their own vocation, if they didn't have a job as such, but maybe they were a wife or a mum or something like that. So I wrote a paper all about what can people in present day jobs in our 21st century learn from Francis de Sales' sort of spirituality of the workplace. And I did a kind of a course on spirituality in the workplace. And so all of that then started to tie in with just the whole thing of God, wider topics of the fact that God's everywhere. You don't have to go into a church to pray it, and the whole Brother Lawrence and practicing the presence of God wherever you are, being aware of God's presence wherever you are, living in the present moment. All those kinds of topics became increasingly important to me. And then I didn't go ahead and become a priest, and I ended up coming to Leicester, which is where I've been the last however many years I've been here, probably about 9-10 now, 9, something like that. So then my two big influences over the last 10 years or so have been church and my own jobs, and my own not becoming a priest. So at church, we had a priest for a number of years who was quite Anglo-Catholic himself, but I just loved his outlook on the true meaning of Christianity. Like, he'd say things like, holiness isn't about keeping yourself apart, it's about like rolling up your sleeves and getting right in the midst of things. And when he was training me to be a server, he'd say things like, it's good to know like the names of different things like chalice and paten and stuff like that, but what's far more important is like the worship itself, and the fact that the church is there for the kingdom of God, not to serve itself. And so a lot of his sermons, he was always coming back to God's love for a start, but always pointing us to the wider picture of the church's place in God's wider plans and in the kingdom of God, which is just something I've been passionate about for years, about looking in the right direction. So he was also someone who just hated churchianity. He wouldn't have used that word, but that's my own word put in his mouth. But so that's something that's just like an ongoing topic that I've cared about a lot over the years, and that's why I liked this particular church, because a lot of the sermons were on that kind of theme. Always pointing us outwards and upwards, obviously, and to God's love. And another theme that came up a lot at church with this priest especially was that obviously it's really important to worship God, but you can't worship God without that having an impact. I mean, without that resulting in you serving others and living a very outward looking life as well. So that priest was a big influence on me over these last few years. And then going from training to be a public figure, a priest, to suddenly having jobs where I wasn't using a lot of the things that I was able to use when I was training to be a priest, like I don't know, preaching, or just like interaction in general, because quite a few of my jobs over the last few years have been ones where I've just been working on my own in silence, or like just working on my own without any colleagues to interact with much. So then the whole spirituality of I went back to Brother Lawrence and the whole praying with God, or being aware of God's presence wherever you are, became really important again in my work day. and so did also the whole Carmelite spirituality of hiddenness. And then I was introduced to Charles de Foucault and the little brothers and sisters of Jesus, and their whole spirituality of a mixture of just being obscure, like Jesus was when he was a carpenter. He didn't stand out in his community, he just was a presence, like a praying presence in the middle of the community, getting on, doing a normal job, and being willing to be hidden. So hiddenness became an important theme in my life, the last few years especially. And then I suppose going back to the fact that I've been growing in more quite Anglo-Catholic, I'd say spirituality, because there's a lot about Anglo-Catholic expression maybe that's really not me, like all the lace and the caring so much what candles lit first, and a lot of the outward stuff is really not me, but I really like the inner spirituality maybe. I'm struggling for all the right words. I like quiet Catholicism rather than like the outward forms of it maybe. I'm really struggling for words. But the Eucharist, or Jesus in the Eucharist, or real presence, if you're familiar with that phrase, has become extremely important to my life, and I've managed to get my work to fit around a daily Eucharist. But also linked to that the more that I have spent time reflecting on Jesus in the Eucharist, and the more that I've spent time in this contemplative prayer that I can't really explain in this video, but yeah, contemplative prayer has been another thing that I've been trying to grow in over these last 10 years or so. The more that I've then other themes that have also then come to the fore in my life have been like one of the things that Mother Teresa kept coming back to is the fact that Jesus is also in the person you walk past in the street, and the person you're serving. So I've got a very strong, what's the word, that the Eucharist is very important to me, and so is like reserved sacrament kept inside a church building. But at the same time, that I'm acknowledging, like the Jesus that I'm acknowledging there, I know is also in the street and in the person I'm helping, in the marginalized person. And so this Eucharistic adoration kind of spirituality hasn't kept me inside a church building or inside church ritual or symbolism. It's also sent me out into the streets, if that makes sense. And then also linked to all my Carmelite reading and the thing of hiddenness, another thing that's come out of all my contemplative prayer and thinking about Jesus in the Eucharist is thinking about how actually all of us have Jesus inside us, and especially it becomes even more profound when you think that when we receive communion, we're taking Jesus inside us. And Elizabeth of the Trinity, I love reading her because I've got the same name as her, and she does a lot of reflecting on the fact that her name means house of God, and how she's got Jesus inside her. And so we as Christians are like aumbries or tabernacles or monstrances, and all these there are words for where Jesus in the Eucharist might be placed in an Anglo-Catholic forms of worship, or in their buildings or something. So yeah, that Elizabeth of the Trinity's kind of spirituality of Jesus inside you wherever you are, in a quite Eucharistic way, has also been another massive influence on me. So it's all it's tricky to explain. So, but I've had a very eclectic upbringing, which is cool because I've done a lot of stuff with churches together and street pastors in recent years, all these ecumenical things. And I suppose because I've been exposed to so many different traditions growing up. And one I forgot to mention is just how many teachers and pupils at my school were Baptist as well as all the charismatics and Black Pentecostals. Um, so yeah, I've had a very eclectic upbringing, and I've had all these different strands at different times of my life adding to the mix. And I suppose especially because I went away to school just after I turned 8, it was when I was about 8 or 9. I remember saying to God that I want to be a Christian of my because I because of my own choosing. I remember saying to God, I know I've been brought up Christian, I know my parents are, but I want to say to you this evening or tonight or whatever that I want to be a Christian, because I'm choosing it for myself. So I remember saying that when I was like 8 or 9, and then yeah, because really a lot of my early spiritual formation from age 8 upwards was actually more at school than it was at home. So as much as I've grown up in a vicar family, uh, my home life probably hasn't had as much of a influence as it would have been if I hadn't gone away to boarding school, obviously. And it also means that, especially in those years at school, a lot of my prayer life was just me sat on my bed in my room or praying with friends. And so I've never had this sense, well, I've never had the sense of God being Anglican or Anglicans being like the only right way or anything like that. And even, yeah, for years and years, I didn't link prayer life to a church building or to a church service, because I've just, right from quite an early age, like God and prayer life and spiritual life is just so much bigger and so much more eclectic than that.
I've just realised I haven't yet mentioned Song of Songs. How have I managed that? Because it's such a big part of my life. I don't know when it crept into my life. Maybe, probably through people like John of the Cross. But for the last 5 or so years now, yes, Song of Songs as a kind of spiritual allegory of our kind of inner spiritual life and God, like that relationship, has been not that influential isn't the word. It's just been something I've kept coming back to, and I've liked reading any kind of spiritual writers and saints for whom Song of Songs is also really influential, and just a lot of Carmelite spirituality does draw on Song of Songs. And so for whatever reason, I'm not claiming to be like a mystic or anything, but for whatever reason, I've particularly been drawn to a lot of writings, or prayers by people that have this word Christian mystic attached to them. Catherine of Siena, I've read I've read a lot more about her than her own like dialogue and stuff, but I've really been drawn to people who had a what you might call a Christian mystical prayer life, but who were also active in their ministry. And so Catherine of Siena has been a big one for me, and Mother Teresa as well. And I've found reading, if you've heard of her, Ruth Burrows, I found reading her book some of the most helpful of all. If I had to choose just like my few favourite books or most helpful books of all time, they probably would be things like, there's a book I've got called Great Mystics and Social Justice. John of the Cross's poetry would have to be one of them, I think. I've got a book called He and I by, I don't know how you pronounce her name, it's probably Gabrielle Bossi, it's Bossis, who is a mystic, who, the book is basically a journal of of conversations she felt that she was having with Jesus, and that's using very, I don't know if romantic's quite the right word, but very kind of mystical language that is very similar to the kind of Song of Songs vibe. Uh, but yeah, so I might try and listen to more books, but that gives you an idea of the yet another strand of spirituality that's been extremely important to me.
I think that will do for this video, but I hope it's been of some use or of some interest to you. And yeah, I couldn't stop and explain all the phrases and terminology if you're not used to them. So I guess this video is more for people that are familiar with the different Christian traditions and styles and stuff. But I hope it was of some interest or use to you.